Hello everyone, my name is Partha Naidu and I am doing my paper presentation on a paper titled Who's in Control of Your Control System? Device Fingerprinting for Cyber-Physical Systems. Now this is specifically for the class Cyber-Physical Systems at Georgia Tech, but I think it has a lot of applications to topics not just in cyber but as well as ICS systems as a whole, because this is really kind of explaining how to best identify and characterize any kind of ICS or SATA system. So let's begin. First, I'd like to make acknowledgments to the authors of this paper that are listed here. Now, this paper was first presented in January of 2016 at a conference titled NDSS. Now, this is a highly cited paper. I was looking at semanticscholar.org, and it's been cited 52 times. I just Googled around, and a lot of people use this paper to kind of base future capabilities, future projects, as well as articles, everything like that. So here's what I'll be talking about today. Specifically, we'll go over the background of kind of ICS and SCADA systems and how cyber plays a role in their day-to-day operations. I'll talk about some related works specific to this paper, the attacker's threat model, targeting cyber physical systems and ICS and SCADA systems. I'll talk about device fingerprinting. We'll go over a discussion of the findings of this paper, and then wrap it up with the conclusion section. So in the background section, I'll be talking about ICS systems overall and how they are different from normal networks. I'll talk about fingerprinting methods as well as the contributions of this paper specifically. So ICS systems, or industrial control systems, is kind of a general term for describing any kind of system that controls uh, large area control systems associated with instrumentation and industrial control processes. A common infrastructure is like the power grid, water supply system, a lot of communication systems that are very big, involving a lot of different subsystems and substations. Now, typically, ICS systems are kind of vital and critical to U.S. infrastructure and are very important to the day-to-day lives of many people. Now, a lot of these systems are also very, very specifically tuned, and they're legacy, so they're not really maintained anymore. They don't have the same kind of processing power as you see in a day-to-day computer right now, because these systems have been around for decades. The current power grid that you have right now is probably an ICS system that's been around for a number of years before the internet and security protocols have kind of really adopted or evolved. These systems are very, very important because they receive data from remote sensors, and a lot of their communication mechanisms are relatively primitive compared to today's kind of technology with regards to encryption, TCP protocols, a lot of those different kinds of things. IC systems simply just don't have. So, a larger subset of systems implemented by supervisory control and data acquisition, otherwise known as SCADA systems, or distributed control systems, DCS, employ PLCs, programmable logic controllers, and between all of these things, they're kind of scaled down to smaller systems with a couple different control mechanisms and control loops. A lot of these networks are kind of segregated from the traditional business network that is associated, the company that's associated with these, and they're very, very kind of logically separated from them, specifically because they want to isolate these systems so other external means cannot kind of compromise them. Compromising ICS and SCADA systems is kind of a huge concern for a lot of lawmakers and military personnel, because this is how like another country could launch an attack. There's a couple different examples of this. The biggest one being Stuxnet, which is a malware that targeted the nuclear development capabilities of Iran. And this was huge because it's the first time that a malware actually caused physical kinetic damage to an industrial control system. Now, in addition to that, we also have some of the security practices. Now, security practices with ICS systems are much different than the traditional approach. The reason being is that there are a lot of legacy protocols that we've kind of talked about before. They don't really have the same kind of protocols. So we use TCP/IP for most of our communication. They use Modbus, DNP3, IEC 61850 Goose, and these have a different set of security challenges because you can't really apply patching or encryption or secure these networks the same kind of way that you secure normal networks. Now let's talk about fingerprinting and what its purposes and some of the methods are. So fingerprinting, just like how you have a fingerprint that uniquely identifies you and your person, fingerprinting for an ICS system is kind of a unique signature that is specific to the system, the ICS system as a whole. Now this can be created from a host of things. So one is the configuration, the products specifically that are being employed, as well as what makes it unique between two identical ICS systems are the actual physical composition of the devices themselves because of impurities, different qualities of construction, and just slight differences like that create a very unique set of data points that you can gather to say this system is unique because of X, Y, and Z. Now, the purpose of fingerprinting devices on an ICS network or a SCADA network, it can provide network administrators with options, mechanisms for kind of identifying what is normal on a network. And when you identify what normal is on a network, if you have a change or a compromise, you can easily pick out, say, like, hey, something weird is going on. So, this is a really great tool for network administrators. Now, even on the other side, from attackers' perspective, you can kind of use fingerprinting to recognize, say, like, what is the attack surface of my target, what kind of operating system is it running, what kind of configuration does it have. There's a lot of information that you can pull from fingerprinting a target network. Now, a fingerprint or signature of a device can be represented by a probability density function, PDF, based off the response times of a lot of different tasks or you run against the network. So specifically, if you want to open or close a valve, the response time is kind of unique if you bring it down to the microsecond of that specific ICS. Now, these are typically generated one of three ways: the white box, black box, or gray box. White box approach is kind of generated based off of the CAD drawing, source code, and all the planning stages of when developing the network. You don't really have access to the ICS network itself or the live network. And then the black box is where you kind of have no access to the the CAD drawings, the project notes, the source code, and you do it based off purely off of experimental data. So you actually just run continuous data sets and experiments on the network to see, like, okay, what are the times and everything like that. And gray box is a little bit of both. So you start with the source code and then you apply the black box experimentation to then validate it and tweak it a little bit. Now, the major contributions of this research kind of includes two new ways of fingerprinting that take advantage of the unique characteristics and properties of ICS networks. They have a new class of fingerprinting generation specific to ICS networks, kind of starting out with white box modeling. It has performance analysis using both real-world and lab environments, and then it has an evaluation of methods, simply under forgery attack kind of methodology, to see how well do these fingerprinting methods hold up in these simple kinds of attacks. Now, these are not the first researchers to kind of look into this topic. Some of the related works kind of explore active and passive fingerprinting techniques. Now, active techniques for fingerprinting is very common among most normal networks, and a very common one is Nmap, which kind of throws a lot of different packets at a specific target system, and then kind of like based off of how the packets respond back, you can identify what ports are open, what the configuration is, what operating system it's running. Now, most prior research to ICS systems have been passive. A lot of the related works that I'll be talking about a little bit now. So one of them is kind of the wavelet analysis approach, which is designed and kind of tested only on wireless access points under a lot of different heavy loads, which doesn't really happen too often in ICS where wired communication is preferred, just because wired communication is a lot more reliable than wireless. Now, another paper was published the following year talking about a device fingerprinting method that kind of looks at application layer protocols using a method TRFSMS. Now, the problem with this methodology is because it only looks at application layer behaviors, and it kind of requires a large data set of all possible sessions to kind of examine, which a lot of times is very difficult to acquire to implement correctly and effectively. And finally, we have a third paper that uses packet inter-arrival times to identify devices and the different types of devices. Again, the problem with this methodology also is that it requires a large number of samples to achieve accurate results. Now let's talk about the attacker's threat model. So with ICS network security, one of the unique challenges is physically securing the network and that can be very, very difficult, especially when it's over 3,000 square miles and over 30 plus subsystems. So an attacker can relatively easily gain access to the network. So how do we then secure it? First, we have to think like an attacker. So there's kind of two different approaches that the paper specifically is kind of exploring. The first approach that an attacker could take is one that is unable to gain physical access, maybe because of a fence or whatever else, or a locked box, but has compromised a low-powered node. And the second is an outsider who has actually gained physical access to the target network. Furthermore, there's different points of attack. So an attacker could, compromise a communications network or the individual devices themselves, like the PLCs that are controlling some of the valves and the power grid and everything like that. Which now brings us to kind of the point of this paper, which is developing two different fingerprinting mechanisms. The first being cross-layer response times. Now, cross-layer response times, I'll get into in a second, but it focuses on the data acquisitions half of the SCADA systems. Now, data acquisition and the control commands, which is the kind of the focus of the second method, are kind of specifically unique to ICS networks and kind of differentiates them between them and other networks because of how often the ICS control systems send commands and polling requirements to measure different levels of whatever the ICS is in charge of, and to kind of constantly get that feedback. Now that's kind of more unique than the traditional network. These two properties are kind of what leads the fingerprinting approach in this research paper. So cross-layer response times focuses on the data acquisition half, whereas the next one is physical fingerprinting, which focuses on the control half. So CLRT kind of looks at how long it takes for the sensors to process a request. So the control system sends a TCP packet, and the time between the TCP acknowledgement and the SCADA response is called the IED processing time. And the IED processing time is going to be very unique for the SCADA system or ICS system because not just the configuration, not just the product type, but also the physical qualities of the product itself, the imperfections, the impurities, and that kind of gives it that fingerprinting. If these times change, then there's something that's not normal. There could be a compromise. Now, why this approach can work for ICS systems is because the networks themselves are very static. It's not changing. There's a set number of control mechanisms and devices on the network, and the operations ongoing the network should be very, very like normal. And because of that, there's not really a huge variance on these IED times. And that's why if there is a compromise, it's very easy to pick out like, hey, this change happened. And if this change is not documented or understood as being planned, then we can say like something has changed on our network and it could be, again, a potential compromise. They tested the cross-layer response times by first experimenting on a large-scale real-world data set. They collected over 5 months about 20 gigabytes of data from a live power substation running DNP3. Then, over a year later, another month of data was collected from the same substation after a change was implemented. They removed the main router and replaced it with a new switch, changing the IP address scheme and some other configurations. So then this change would then change the device fingerprint, and could this cross-layer response time kind of pick up on that change? Furthermore, they also pulled at another ICS subsystem that had about 80 devices to test the hypothesis of like one configuration device fingerprinting could then be applied to another ICS system without doing the whole black box approach of validating the data through experimental means. In addition, further tests were then conducted in a lab environment using the white box approach without having any experimental data to see the effects of just the software configuration alone to rule out any, again, possible imperfections in the hardware. Now, the researchers applied various mechanisms to identify whether or not the data they pulled back was able to determine which products and vendors. And I'm going to summarize that real quick, but the two big approaches that they had were supervised and unsupervised machine learning to determine can this mechanism, this device fingerprinting methodology, be used to determine what device products, what brand they are, as well as the configurations. And they were able to with about 99% accuracy versus 92% accuracy with unsupervised learning. Now, the reason why unsupervised learning is very important is because a lot of times network administrators don't have a full map of their ICS systems and IP addresses associated with each device and everything like that, which is kind of required for supervised learning. So the unsupervised approach is very important to test out, and the 93% figure is actually very promising because that's about the exact same as existing fingerprinting devices, actually a little bit higher. Now, the second approach for fingerprinting that the paper produces is called physical fingerprinting, which is similar to CLRT. However, this kind of focuses on the operational times of the sensors themselves, specifically talking about the unique physical properties of each of the sensors. And the operation time measurements are then taken and used to build that fingerprint. Now, these operation times can be estimated in one of two ways. The first is unsolicited response timestamps, which is calculated by the operating system that kind of takes the difference between the time which the command is observed and the time which is the response has been observed. The second is being the SARE response timestamps, which is the difference between the time which was the command observed at the tap point and then the application level event timestamp. So the experiment was carried out through a circuit breaker operation, kind of testing the response times between open and closing the circuit breaker. Unfortunately, the unsolicited response method did not produce any reusable results, so the SARE method is kind of like the only thing that brought back usable results for this experiment. For these experiments, about 2,500 open and close commands were issued simultaneously over the span of a few seconds with 20 seconds between operations. Now, these commands and the responses were then recorded at the tap as well as the timestamps to determine that specific close operation times. Now, the physical fingerprinting mechanism was able to differentiate between two products, between two vendors, would had the same ratings. However, the physical makeup between the two products was differing, and they were able to capture the difference with different timestamp models. Furthermore, they were also able to repeat this experiment to say the difference between operations themselves. So, close operations between open operations was able to be distinguished within a single device, determine if the device had opened or closed in response to a command. Now, these differences could be attributed to other things, but I think physical construction of the components is what the research is saying that is impacting the act to open or close the relay. So long story short, 92% accuracy again fits within existing fingerprinting models, and it's still very accurate given ICS fingerprinting techniques. So again, the researchers kind of struck gold with this approach. So in this discussion section, I'm going to talk about the performance, robustness against forgery, and the limitations of the fingerprinting approaches, CLRT, and the physical fingerprinting. So while neither physical fingerprinting or the CLRT approach got 100%, they are well within the comparable range of the other papers that we addressed earlier, which range from 86% to about 100%. So these are viable fingerprinting options. Furthermore, scalability is also a question with regards to applying any approach to a real world application. And the CLRT fingerprinting was tested at full scale ICS. And physical fingerprinting is actually expected to improve its efficiency when you have an increase in diversity of devices because you have a larger data set. And some of the algorithms that they applied to identifying the data that they pulled back, FFAN, and the Bayes algorithms provides reasonable scalability for computational complexity as complexity increases. So, long story short, performance of these both these fingerprinting approaches is actually very promising. Now, the researchers wanted to find out how well their fingerprinting methodology was able to assist network administrators detect forging attacks. And they were able to do this with some actual experimentation to validate their mechanisms. One thing to note before we begin on this topic is that it's actually very difficult to forge ICS fingerprinting, mainly because there's always going to be inherent randomness in an attacker's mechanism and workstations that kind of will impact the times that we've been trying to calculate with regards to response times and everything like that. With regards to physical fingerprinting operation time forgery, the attacker's clock on a modern day computer is actually very accurate. However, ICS systems have a lot of legacy systems, and they actually a lot of time drift within the internal clock. And matching up with the internal clock of an ICS system would require a tremendous amount of knowledge into the ICS system itself. So this waiver can be enough to identify some of these problems and some of these compromises. Now, they went back to that scenario that we talked about earlier with having a weak and strong adversary, one that could have access, who is a strong adversary to the network, as well as the weak adversary having only access to a specific device. And both of them, with regards to the CLRT fingerprinting technique, was able to identify with high accuracy detection of the forgery, the method. Similarly, the physical fingerprinting operation time forgery attacks were also able to be identified due to the slight shift in times, as you can see in these graphs. So both physical fingerprinting and CLRT was able to identify these forging attacks, these trivial forging attacks. Now, the paper does admit that these attacks are trivial because they talk about how a more advanced adversary could specifically time and tune their internal clock of their attacker machine, synchronized with the ICS clock. But again, as we've stated before, this would require a significantly more knowledgeable and skilled adversary that would require a lot of information and knowledge into the existing ICS prior to them conducting this attack. Now let's talk about some of the limitations of the device fingerprinting approaches discussed in this paper. The first, CRLT fingerprinting requires read and response messages that are used by most SCADA protocols. Now these protocols sit on top of the TCP implementation that uses a lot of acts, so minimum act time is required for determining how quickly a fingerprint can be generated. And physical fingerprinting requires protocols that have timestamp capability, and not all of the SCADA protocols support that functionality. Furthermore, the highest accuracies that CRLT fingerprinting and physical fingerprinting achieved was 99% and 92% respectively. Now, while those are very strong numbers, that still has a 1% and 8% false positive rating. This would then have a human analyst look through the intrusion detection system to then look through the false positives and determine, hey, this is actually not an intrusion, this is just a false positive, which then would increase the overhead costs of maintaining and defending this system. Now, it's also important to discuss the limitations of white box and black box modeling. Specifically, white box would require a lot of insight into the ICS system, including the source code, the drawings and schematics, and everything like that. And not every system administrator who is on the job has these and has access to these because of proprietary knowledge based off of configurations and build qualities and all that. Furthermore, black box modeling is very time intensive and can take up a lot of resources developing that with, again, high accuracy, but you might not have the time and resources to spend developing the fingerprint. So today we talked about the background related works with regards to device fingerprinting and ICS systems, how an attacker would actually compromise and attack an ICS system, the device fingerprinting approaches outlined in this paper, and then how well they did against attack forgeries, as well as identifying products and differentiating between different products and different configurations. So overall, this paper was very interesting to read. mainly because this is kind of how you defend a network. In order for you to defend a network, you're supposed to know the network and know what normal is, because if you don't know what normal looks like, you cannot identify the abnormal. And this is exactly what this paper looked to do, and I think they did an awesome job. So this concludes my presentation. If you guys have any questions, feel free to post on the Piazza link below, and I look forward to answering your questions and having a great discussion about this awesome topic. Thank you so much for your time.